Saints. We have all heard of them, and even if you are not of the Catholic faith, you are probably at least somewhat familiar with the concept. But in case you aren't, a saint, often known as a patron saint, is believed to offer special protection, guidance, or the ability to intervene for a specific group of people, place, or activity. For example, St. Patrick, the patron saint of the country of Ireland, or one we discussed previously, St. Joseph, the patron saint of carpentry. Saints are typically there for people to turn to for help or inspiration in the area of need or interest, and there are just so many of these that we can never discuss them all, as the Catholic faith alone recognizes more than 10,000 saints, which includes some that are not recognized but still considered unofficial by many, which also means there's a ton of unofficial ones, not to mention other sects of Christianity also recognize some saints not considered official. But of all the saints we could discuss, we're going to look at one specific one, a man whose origin and story is very mysterious. But he may be the most important saint to our friends in the old country of England, that of St. George. As mentioned, we know precious little about him, although there is a pretty steady line of thought that has not changed over time that links George to living around the 3rd or maybe early 4th century. He was of Cappadocian Greek descent and served as a Roman military officer, even making it to the elite unit of Praetorian Guard, who served as the emperor's bodyguard. And it's here his first deed would go down in legend, as the Roman Emperor Diocletian was in charge and continued on with the persecution of Christians that occurred from the 1st to 4th century. But George, well see, this really conflicted with his beliefs, because George had become a Christian, and he refused to recant his faith. Even when he was given the choice between that and death, George chose to become a martyr and die for his beliefs, and in some records, he would be beheaded on April 23, 303 AD. It was this act that led to George being labeled as one of the few so-called great martyrs, who are usually described as undergoing excruciating torture, performing miracles, and/or converting unbelievers. And some accounts say he converted close to 41,000 people, so a big deal to say the least. Because of this, he would go on to become one of the most popular saints and heroes, especially once the Crusades began, and he has went on to become the patron saint for countries such as Bulgaria, Georgia, Ethiopia, and a few others. But most important to our story, England. And I guess it's important to point out now that these saints do not have to actually be linked to the countries they become connected with. Sometimes it can just be due to shared values, beliefs, or traditions. And although it's probably almost certain George never visited England, according to the story, George, who was still a soldier at this point, was said to have been traveling through the village of Uffington when he came upon a disturbing sight. It was here that he found that a dragon had descended upon the quite small town and began demanding tribute. This was anything from sheep and other livestock to trinkets. But soon, the poor village ran out of all this and could no longer keep the dragon happy. This led to them striking up a deal. They would hand over their children, who were chosen by lottery, and given to the dragon to devour as part of its tribute and to keep it from destroying the village. It was at this point the king's daughter's name was selected in the lottery, which you would think he could have arranged for that not to happen. Regardless, the king was now in a tough spot. Would he really have to sacrifice his daughter? Luckily, he did not, because George, who was now on the scene, was not having any of it. He would actually end up riding in just as she was being led to the dragon. George was horrified and stated he would slay the dragon. And as during this battle, George discovered a vulnerable patch of skin under the dragon's arm. He charged forward with the sword and killed the beast. And it would be a millennia later, in 1327, that King Edward III would make George the country's official saint. But as mentioned, it's almost certain George never visited England. So where does this tale come from? Well, its first official known record comes from the 11th century, some 800 years after George's life, and is found in a source in the country of Georgia, where it would then reach the rest of Catholic Europe about 100 years later, largely thanks to the Crusades. But it really spread in the 13th century thanks to a collection of 153 biographies of saints called Golden Legend. And it's here that St. George was said to have went to a place called Salem, located somewhere in Libya. It was here that a venom-spewing dragon lived in a nearby pond and poisoned the countryside. To prevent it from poisoning the city itself, the people offered 2 sheep daily, then a man and a sheep, and finally children and youths, which were chosen by lottery. But once the lottery came up for the princess, the king offered all his gold and silver to have her spared. But the people refused, so she was sent to the lake, dressed as a bride, and was set to be fed to the dragon. But that's when our hero, St. George, arrives, just by pure chance. The princess tried to make him leave to spare the city, but he had none of it. And while she was pleading with him to leave, the dragon emerged. George made the sign of the cross and charged it on horseback, seriously wounding it with his lance. He then called on the princess to throw him her belt or rope that she was wearing. He then put this on the dragon like a leash and gave it to the princess, and it now followed her around like a weak animal. They then walked back to Salem, where obviously it freaked everyone out. George told them he would kill the dragon, only if they converted to Christianity and got baptized. This led to 15,000 men and the king converting. George then killed the dragon and beheaded it, and the body was taken out on carts. So over time, the story got twisted over and over until the people of England made it their own and changed it up a little bit in the process. But it actually goes back even further than that. Going back to the 3rd century BC, some 600 years before George, the Thracian horseman was a recurring motif found in tablets which showed a man riding a horse, often accompanied by a hunting dog, in which they were attacking various creatures, sometimes a boar, but oftentimes a serpent. By the 5th century AD, the trampling of serpents began popping up in Christian art, and actually began linking a Saint Theodore as the dragon slayer first, which over time, and over many other tellings, would eventually change to George being the dragon slayer by the 11th century, which means tales of St. George defeating a dragon didn't appear for well over 500 years after his death. So all in all, it was a little bit of fact fused with a little bit of legend, which saw the dragon slaying as an allegory of good versus evil, a real-world evil, like the tyranny of an emperor that led to the martyrdom of St. George. Others suggest that it may have been a real incident, but instead, George killed a huge crocodile tormenting a town, or a venomous snake. It's even possible the dragon symbolized the pagan religions which were being buried in England in favor of Christianity, regardless of which, it led to probably the most famous saint that we know the least about. And while we do know that it is a fact that George did die during the very real Diocletianic persecution aimed at Christians in the Roman army, chances are very likely he didn't kill a dragon. Much to the disappointment of every paladin who insists their 2nd level divine smite can take down a full-grown red dragon. "10:30 a.m. on Valentine's Day, 1929. 7 men from the Bugs Moran gang would be lured to an abandoned warehouse in the neighborhood of Lincoln Park in Chicago, under the guise of getting a cut of a stolen shipment of whiskey. After they arrived, a Cadillac sedan would pull up and stop in front of the garage, and 4 men got out, 2 of who were dressed as police officers, and entered the warehouse. The 2 fake officers would then order Bugs Moran's gang up against the wall. They, along with the 2 men dressed in civilian clothes, would then open fire with Thompson submachine guns and proceeded to mow the men down. Witnesses would state after this that the 2 men in police uniforms would lead the men dressed in civilian clothing out at gunpoint, which was just to give the illusion that the police had everything under control and so no witnesses would call the real police. The victims were as follows: Peter Gusenberg, Frank Gusenberg, Albert Kachelik, Adam Hayer, Reinhard Schwimmer, Albert Weinshank, and John May. And as previously mentioned, 5 of them were in the North Side Gang, which was then headed by George Bugs Moran. Surprisingly, Frank Gusenberg survived the initial onslaught despite being shot 14 times and was taken to the hospital. Police would ask him who was behind it, and he said, "No one shot me." But things would then take a turn for the worse, and Frank died a few hours later. Detectives quickly surmised that the massacre had been an attempt to kill Bugs Moran, which ultimately failed, and the real person behind it was most likely Al Capone, the most famous gangster in history. He's basically the guy that every gangster movie character is based on. He is the OG, and it was over nothing more that Capone wanted control of the Chicago bootlegging trade, which is very lucrative. This is one of those that is kind of an unofficial mystery, meaning everyone knows who was behind it. There was just no way to prove it. It's pretty much a given that Capone was behind it, but for the men who actually pulled the trigger, that's hotly debated and can be any number of men employed by Capone. But at the end of the day, it was still him, and for that reason, it's not really a mystery. Since the dawn of early man, people have believed in such paranormal topics that are usually deemed ridiculous now, like shamans, voodoo, and witchcraft. And it's witchcraft in particular that we're going to take a look at here, because between the 1300s and 1600s, a witch craze swept through Europe, and unfortunately led to tens of thousands of alleged witches, who were mostly women, being executed. And it's somewhat ironic that just as this paranoia was dying down in Europe, it was only beginning in colonial New England, where the Salem witch trials would start to go down in infamy as one of the darkest periods in America. Although it began in February 1692, the seeds for it were sowed in 1689, when the English monarchs, William and Mary, would start a war with France in the territory of the American colonies. It would go on to become known as King William's War, and it tore apart upstate New York, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, which in turn sent refugees into the county of Essex, and more specifically into Salem Village, which was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This, of course, caused a mini humanitarian crisis because it put tremendous strain on the small village's resources and in turn fired up an already existing rivalry between the families there. Families that had ties to the wealth of the port of Salem, which depended on agriculture. But that wasn't all. A Reverend Samuel Parris soon would become Salem Village's first ordained minister in 1689 and quickly gained a reputation for being very rigid as well as being very greedy. And to top it off, the area had just overcame a smallpox epidemic and were always on edge due to the ever-present threats of Native American attacks. So all of this kind of created the perfect storm. In short, tensions were high and all it needed was a spark. And the spark it would get. Because in January 1692, the Reverend Samuel Parris's daughter, Elizabeth, aged only 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, age 11, started having, quote, fits. These fits allegedly were the girls screaming, throwing things, uttering peculiar sounds, and contorting themselves into strange positions. The Reverend would quickly take the girls to a local doctor named William Griggs, who looked at the pair and said, yep, this is the work of the supernatural. And what should have been chalked up to a manic episode, or perhaps a desperate plea for attention, would spiral out of control because another girl would then pop up, Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, and she also claimed to experience similar panic attacks. And just a month later, the village was on edge and it forced magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne, colonial officials, to get to the bottom of this. They would speak to the girls who, for some odd reason, blamed 3 women for afflicting them. One was a Caribbean woman enslaved by the Parris family, Tituba, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly impoverished woman. Well, this was all the bored crazy Puritans needed, because this led to several days of interrogations of the 3 women. By March 1st, 2 of them, both of the Sarahs, claimed innocence, but Tituba oddly confessed and stated that the devil came to her and bid her to serve him. She began telling a fanciful story of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a tall man with white hair who wanted her to sign his book, to which she did, and she claimed there were several witches in the area who wanted to destroy the Puritans. Now why she said this, I do not know. Maybe she had some kind of mental illness, or actually believed it, or maybe she just hated her life as a slave and who could blame her. But this would cause that spark to light a stick of dynamite, because paranoia was now out of control, and there would be a steady line of accusations coming in over the next few months. One in particular was that of a woman named Martha Corey, known for her fierce loyalty to the church in Salem. Heck, if she could be a witch, anyone could. They even questioned Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorothy, who I'm pretty sure was scared by the interrogation, and regardless of that, they took her answers as a confession. By this time, it was getting out of control, with just dozens of people having to come from not only Salem, but surrounding villages as well. To be questioned about being a witch, the governor would respond by sending the deputy governor, Thomas Danforth, to get down to the hearings, while he also set up a special court to try the cases. The first woman to be tried was Bridget Bishop on May 27th, an older woman who, allegedly, gossiped way too much and liked to sleep around. When asked if she was a witch, she stated she was innocent as an unborn child, but I guess that wasn't very convincing because she was found guilty and hanged just 2 weeks later. Now I want to stop here and point out one critical thing. The Puritans, as well as the Christian faith in general, has taken a real beating over this, and it's often led to them being mocked for the horrible things they did during this period. But there were some people that spoke out, sorta. Enter Cotton Mather, Harvard alumni, Puritan clergyman, and author, who was widely respected and wrote a letter to the court asking them not to allow spectral evidence. And what is that, you might ask? It's basically testimony from dreams and visions where the so-called victim of witchcraft would claim the witch had entered their dreams and tortured them. It was widely accepted, which was incredibly stupid considering there was no way to refute it. And here was Cotton Mather pointing this out to the court, who just ignored him and hanged 5 more people in July, 5 more in August, and 8 in September. Although I should note that Cotton Mather is also blamed by a lot of historians for whipping up the witch panic to begin with, but thankfully, Governor William Phipps, who had ordered the court to be set up and to try the witches, soon found his own wife being questioned as a suspected witch. This clearly shook him up, and he prohibited any more arrests and released a ton of the suspected witches. He then dissolved the court, replaced it with a new one which did not allow spectral evidence, and it was only able to find 3 of the 56 accused witches guilty. And by May 1693, Governor Phipps pardoned these and all of the others who were still in prison. Of course, that was far too late for the families that had already lost a loved one. In total, 19 men and women were hanged, while Martha Corey, the woman we mentioned as the most loyal churchgoer who was suspected of being a witch early on, saw her husband Giles pressed to death with heavy stones after refusing to testify. This was particularly gruesome, as Corey was an 81-year-old farmer that basically had all this weight laid on him, hoping to get him to agree to enter a plea, and he did not. And he was crushed to death by the stones. In addition, another 5 people died in jail waiting on the trials. 25 people died in all, but there were many more, over 160 at least, that were accused and jailed and lost their property and rights. To her credit, Ann Putnam, 14 years later, confessed her deep sorrow and regret at the events of 1692. She stated she was just a child and accused several innocent people of a terrible crime, and for some, it brought their deaths. She of course blamed Satan for misleading her. She also stated she did not make up the accusations because she was mad at them or because she hated them. In fact, she had no hard feelings against them at all. Just 10 years after the events, the courts also declared the trials unlawful, and 9 years after that, they restored the rights and good names of many of the accused, as well as paying money to the heirs of the ones that had died. Massachusetts would formally apologize 250 years later, and by July 2022, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., the last convicted witch, whose name was the only one not cleared, was officially exonerated. So, did a combination of all these refugees entering the town, plus church politics, family feuds, and potentially mentally ill children, or children screaming out for attention, plus a smallpox epidemic and Indian attacks, really cause all this death? Was it really just paranoia and mass hysteria? Historians are divided, but it's probably a mixture of all that and for other reasons we just don't know. Some have even speculated that it could be traced to ergotism, a condition caused by eating foods contaminated with the fungus ergot, and is also famous for causing another case of mass hysteria, that of the dancing plague of 1518. But this has been heavily disputed, as the Puritans had already learned how to avoid bad rye by the 1690s. Regardless, people are still fascinated with this case to this day. Children of the 80s and 90s have a unique aspect to their childhood that many children who grew up in other times just don't understand, because they never lived it. And that aspect I'm referring to is the Satanic Panic. That's right, Starting in 1980 and going on into the 90s, these strange, unsubstantiated claims, over 12,000 of them, of satanic ritual abuse would begin to pop up everywhere. It began in the US with a now discredited book called Michelle Remembers, written by Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pasdar and his patient, who would become his wife, Michelle Smith. Pasdar used a controversial and now discredited practice called recovered memory therapy, which supposedly allowed a patient to recall previously forgotten memories. And in this case, it led to Michelle making all these weird claims about being abused in these satanic rituals. And much like the Salem witch trials we previously covered, this created a mass hysteria that spread across the United States, only this time, it couldn't be blamed on eating foods contaminated with fungus. But for whatever reason, tons of reports began to pour in of physical and other forms of abuse at the hands of these satanic cults that were hidden all over America. The story would get even crazier with allegations of a vast global satanic cult that were allied with the elite and wealthy and would abduct children to be used in the darkest causes. Soon, daytime talk shows began discussing teenagers who listened to heavy metal or got together with their friends to play Dungeons and Dragons. These were considered two of the biggest evils in the country, and that's not a joke. It also led to a number of high-profile cases such as the McMartin preschool trial, which members of the McMartin family, who operated a preschool, would be charged with hundreds of acts of abuse, and whose investigation and trial lasted over 7 years and ended with no convictions, which might be because, in addition to the abuse claims, there were claims of seeing witches fly around at the school, the children traveling in a hot air balloon, and also being taken to an underground tunnel which didn't exist. One of the children even identified Chuck Norris as one of the suspects, as well as claims they were being flushed down a toilet to a secret room. The case only got weaker when it was learned that Judy Johnson, the woman who made the first allegations about the school, was suffering from mental illness. And of course, the very famous West Memphis 3 case, who were teenagers convicted in 1994 for the murders of 3 boys in alleged satanic rituals, and were later released due to the dubious evidence and the fact that they were basically convicted because they were living the goth lifestyle during the Satanic Panic, which leads to a scarier thought. There's probably numerous other people due to the Satanic Panic that are sitting in prison for crimes that never happened. But if Satan's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist, then the Satanic Panic's greatest trick was convincing Americans that it went away in the 90s. Because according to many who study the mass hysteria, the Satanic Panic basically just become QAnon along with numerous other conspiracies, which now spreads quicker due to the internet and particularly social media like Facebook, which has done to our parents what our parents said video games would do to us. But it still has to be asked, how did one story spread so fast in the 80s due to one book that was built on a therapy method that was later discredited? That is where it gets a little more interesting. This can really be traced to the late 60s and 70s, with Charles Manson and their murders, as well as the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey being released around that time. And then, in 1973, the blockbuster film The Exorcist was released, which was claimed to have been based on a true story, and really transformed the psyche of America, and in the process turned the previously harmless Ouija board into some kind of demonic spirit infestation. And from here, it would spiral, because in 1972, Christian evangelist Mike Warnke would write Satan's Cellar, which recounted a childhood and young adulthood he spent in intense satanic worship. It's here he would write that he and a satanic high priest were engaged in ritualistic sex orgies, and all of that was exposed as lies in 1992, as he made the entire thing up. But unfortunately, in that 20-year time period, he became known as an expert on Satanism and was trotted out on many different talk shows and other forms of media, just firing up the Satanic Panic even more. And Mike Warnke was not alone. During this time, there were a ton of these self-proclaimed former Satanists who become fixtures in the American public. They would tell these stories about dark occult symbols that you might randomly see spray painted out on a wall or bridge, which might be connected to this grand conspiracy. And since they were now converting to Christianity, these grifters got a lot of invites from churches and the such, as well as talk shows, where they were invited to speak about the dangers of Satanism. And I'm sure that these invitations came with a payment, which led to more and more grifters coming out and taking advantage of gullible people, much like now with Q and social media. And by the late 70s, Americans would witness the Jonestown Massacre, and while not satanic, it was a cult, and it happened just 2 years from the beginning of the Satanic Panic. Not only that, but the 70s was at the height of the serial killer, which many were believed to be intertwined with the occult. So when the 80s arrived, much like Salem, it was ready to explode. It just needed that spark provided by the book Michelle Remembers. Once it took off, fundamentalist preachers got in on the action, as well as the Crusaders who were doing everything they could to outlaw Dungeons and Dragons. And since I mentioned Michelle Remembers again, I want to point out, after that book took off, tons of numerous other copycat memoirs popped up that alleged satanic abuse, all in the chance to make some money off the panic, which were all shown to be false. And we also have to mention the media, which was being the media. They smelled money from the stories, and they stoked the flames of the fire, often blowing the claims way out of proportion, leading to, in fact, Geraldo Rivera's documentary, Devil Worship, exposing Satan's underground, which was the highest rated documentary to air up to that point. Meanwhile, other documentaries were trying to tie rock music to the occult, while some Satanic Panic experts were claiming Satan worshippers were everywhere and anywhere, and could even be your neighbor, which didn't help the situation any. By 1992, the Justice Department thoroughly debunked the satanic ritual abuse case myth, and by the mid-90s, the claims started to die down. Although, in 1994, a police training video called The Law Enforcement Guide to Satanic Cults was released, and it featured one man who sported 3 different haircuts and was allegedly a former Satanist who taught viewers how to search for the clues of an alleged cultist. All in all, it was a great time to be had for all, and continues to be so to this day. In the year 1390 AD, our next intriguing historical artifact would get its starting point, when a bishop named Pierre d'Assy would write a memorandum where he charged an item called the Shroud was nothing more than a forgery. But what in the world was this a reference to? Many of you already know. At this time, there seemed to be a shroud floating around Europe, which bore the resemblance of a crucified man, who you no doubt will probably already know who. This shroud was in the possession of a man named Geoffroy de Charnay, who lived in the small town of Liry, France, sometime between 1353 and 1357. And that's pretty much how this famous Christian relic would get its start. Before this, we have no idea how it came into the possession of this man, and up until 1390, we really don't know where the shroud was or who had it. It's a mystery that is debated up until this day. However, by the 15th century, the shroud would be documented extremely well. The item I am talking about is, of course, the Shroud of Turin, which is a piece of linen cloth that has the faint image of a man on the front and back, and many believe that man was Jesus. But was it? That's the big question with this one. There's such a lack of records and contradicting claims that it just makes it a very controversial piece, leaving it open to many fringe theories. Although there are no official records of the shroud before the 14th century, there are reports that allegedly one of the Byzantine emperors owned an important burial cloth. There's even a piece of art from the 10th century which shows an oblong cloth with a man's face on it, which many believe is the artist's depiction of the shroud, which then disappeared during the sack of Constantinople in 1204. While other reports have cited that the Knights Templar allegedly were in possession of a relic showing a red monochromatic image of a bearded man on linen or cotton. There are several different theories on the shroud's actual dating and origin, and it would just take forever to get through. But I will note that in 1988, 3 different radiocarbon dating tests performed show conclusively that the shroud dated back to 1260 to 1390 AD, which kinda closes the door on a lot of these theories for some people, but others have vehemently argued that the tests were wrong because the samples were defective, citing contamination by bacteria or carbon monoxide from smoke, which came from a fire where it was once stored. Others have suggested that the portion tested came from a repair done to the shroud in the 14th century, and it's still basically heavily disputed to this day. In fact, the story is currently in the news during the writing of this in September 2024, as a nuclear engineer, Robert Rucker, claims that after studying the physics of Jesus' body's disappearance and the imprint of the shroud for over 10 years, he believes that it does in fact date to the 1st century AD, because according to him, Jesus' resurrection would have caused a supernatural burst of energy which would cause inaccurate testing that led to the suggested date of 1260 to 1390 AD. As of now, he plans to present his research in the following weeks, but most scholars still believe the much later 14th century dating, citing the consistent results produced by radiocarbon dating, and the fact that there is no record of it anywhere before the 14th century, and some suggest that it was nothing more than artwork, noting the 3-to-1 twill pattern not typical of 1st century textiles, but more typical of the medieval period. Christmas Eve, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. A family known as the Sodders were celebrating Christmas. The young children, Martha, 12 years old, Jenny, 8 years old, and Betty, 5 years old, were super excited after their older sister, 19-year-old Marion, had surprised them with new toys. In fact, the young ones were so excited they wanted to stay up past their normal bedtime. Their mother, also named Jenny, would tell them at 9 p.m. that they could stay up a little bit later, so long as the two oldest boys that were still awake, that of 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old Louis, put the cows in the barn and went to feed the chickens, and then go to bed themselves. They were not the oldest brothers in general though, as the couple had 10 children, 9 that were still living at home. The two oldest sons were John, 22, and George Jr., 16, who after a long day of working on the farm with their father, were already fast asleep, but the two younger sons did as they were told and finished up their chores before taking their 3-year-old sister Sylvia upstairs, and they all went to bed. And this is where things would get crazy, because around 12:30 a.m., the telephone would begin to ring. Jenny, the mother, would rush down to answer it, and on the other line was a woman whom she did not recognize, asking for someone who did not live there. This person was perhaps someone at a Christmas party, because in the background, Jenny heard people laughing and glasses clinking around. Jenny would tell the woman she had the wrong number, and the woman responded with a weird laugh, leaving Jenny to hang up and return to bed, probably thinking someone drunk dialed them. But she would notice something strange on her way back up to bed, that being the lights were still on downstairs, which was odd since the kids always turned them off, and the curtains were wide open. Again, odd, because the kids always shut them before bed. She did see Marion, the 19-year-old who had fell asleep on the couch, so Jenny logically assumed the other kids went upstairs to sleep. So she turned out the lights and closed the curtains and went back to bed. However, the strangeness did not end, because 30 minutes later, at 1 a.m., Jenny would be awoken again, this time when she heard an object hitting the roof really hard, making a loud noise and then rolling down off the side of the home. Jenny, who was probably pretty sleepy at this point, waited and heard nothing else and went back to sleep. 30 minutes later, we would get one of the most unforgettable mysteries ever, because Jenny would awake again at 1:30 a.m. to smell smoke and see her husband George's office on fire around the telephone line and fuse box. She of course woke him, who in turn woke their older sons. The parents plus 4 of their children, Marion, who was on the couch, 3-year-old Sylvia, the 2 oldest sons, John and George Jr., all made it out safely, but not before frantically yelling for the children in the attic to get out because the house was on fire, as no one could get to them because the stairway was already on fire, which is something we will come back to. Things were now dire as the phone was not working, and one of the parents had to rush over to the neighbors to call the fire department, although a driver nearby who had seen the fire would stop at a local tavern and tried to call the fire department but couldn't get through. Regardless, he or one of the Sodders eventually got a hold of the fire department. George, in the meantime, decided to climb the wall of the home and smash out a window, gashing his arm doing so. The plan was then to grab the ladder and lay it up against the attic and take the children out that way, but strangely, the ladder was missing from its typical location, and because of the panic, they couldn't find it, while also tragically, water in a nearby barrel, which possibly could have been used to put out the fire, had turned to ice. George then rushed down to pull his work trucks up to the home, which he then planned to use them to climb up and rescue the kids that way. But crazily, neither one of his work trucks would start, in spite of the fact that they had been working before. Devastated, there was little the family could do other than watch it burn down as the fire department were nowhere near. In fact, because of World War II, they didn't really have enough men to respond to fires adequately, and it took one firefighter calling the next one, who called the next one, and so forth, until a team could be put together. Then, once that happened, they did not have anyone that was actually capable of driving the fire truck. It took several hours until 8 a.m. when they finally made it, and obviously, the Sodders didn't have that long. In fact, the home collapsed in about 45 minutes, presumably killing the other 5 children in the process, that of 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha Lee, 10-year-old Lewis, 8-year-old Jenny Irene, and 5-year-old Betty Dolly. By the time firefighters did arrive, all they could do was look through the ashes, but after a search, they found no remains of the other children. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, would tell the parents they did expect to find something, so it was kind of odd that they did not, but regardless, he believed they did perish in the fire. Morris would then tell George to not bother the area as the state fire marshal was coming to do a more thorough investigation. But when no one showed up for 4 days, George and Jenny could no longer take it, so they bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over it where they planned to build a memorial garden in dedication of the children. The next day, an inquest was held, which found that the fire was caused by faulty wiring. And this is where things take an interesting turn, because one of the men on this jury, unbeknownst to the Sodder family at the time, had words with George in the past. Apparently, George was outspoken and really hated Italian dictator Mussolini, which didn't always go over well in this heavily Italian-populated area. This man was an insurance salesman who had visited the Sodders one day trying to sell life insurance, and after George declined, the man warned him that his house would go up in smoke and children would be destroyed. However, this wasn't the only odd thing that happened to the Sodders. Shortly after this, another man would visit the home looking for work and told George his fuse boxes would cause a fire one day, which after George thought was strange since it was practically new, but he had it checked out anyway by the power company, who assured him they were completely safe. While just the previous Christmas, George's older sons had told their father about a strange car that had parked along a highway in town, and whoever was inside watched the younger Sodder children on their way home from school, and watched them in such a way that it had alarmed the older brothers. Regardless of all these strange things that had occurred, it was just kind of ignored, and 5 death certificates were issued just 5 days later on December 30th. Then, a funeral was held on January 2nd, but the parents were too devastated to attend. Interestingly, a local newspaper covering the events first reported that the bodies had been found, then corrected the story and said only one of the bodies was found, which neither was true. But it just kind of goes to show how crazy this mystery would get. And you might be thinking, well, this is a tragic story, but not really a mystery, and you would actually probably fit in with what the majority think. However, the fact that no remains were ever found, well, it's led to a mystery that something else happened to the kids, because the Sodders began to move forward as best as they could, but it was hard to let go of. Like any parent that lost a child, they questioned everything. They wondered about the electrical problem. Why did the Christmas lights remain on when everything else went off during the early part of the fire? More importantly, what about the ladder that was not in its usual location? Well, yeah, about that. It was actually some 75 feet away at the bottom of the embankment. Then things got really sketchy. A telephone repairman would tell the Sodders that after investigating further, the phone line to the home had not been burned. In fact, it had been cut by someone who would have had to climb 14 feet up the pole and then reach 2 feet from the pole just to cut it. Furthermore, neighbors reported that a block and tackle, which is pulleys and rope or cable used to lift heavy loads, in this case a vehicle, was stolen from the Sodder property around the time of the fire. The guy would be arrested and admitted he stole it, and claimed he did cut the phone line thinking it was a power line, but claimed he had nothing to do with the fire. Crazily, we don't even know who this guy is, as records are lost, destroyed, or never existed in the first place. Furthermore, nobody knows what stealing the block and tackle had to do with cutting power lines. The whole thing sounds fishy. There was also the fact that many of the appliances in the home were still standing and recognizable, along with the roof, which did not burn, yet not one bone was found. Making matters even stranger is that bone doesn't break down completely until temperatures reach 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which this fire was allegedly nowhere near that hot. The trucks not starting was also mysterious, although it's possible in their haste they may have inadvertently flooded the engines trying to start them. And while the phone call was mysterious, that woman was eventually traced down and confirmed that she had simply misdialed. By that spring, another layer would be added onto the story, when a bus driver claimed he passed through an area on Christmas Eve and he had witnessed people throwing what looked like balls of fire at the home, which makes you wonder why he waited so long to come forward with this account. But it did seem possible, as little 3-year-old Sylvia had stumbled across small hard dark green rubber ball-like objects in the brush afterwards. The family began to wonder if these homemade fireballs had been thrown onto the roof, and that was what Jenny heard that night. But it got crazier because more people came forward claiming to have seen the children afterwards. One witness watching the fire from the road allegedly seen a passing car with the children inside looking as they drove away. Another woman at a rest stop said she served them breakfast and said they had been in a car with a Florida license plate. This ultimately would lead to the family hiring a private investigator, and this detective pretty quickly discovered that although there were no remains found, rumors suggested that the fire chief had actually found the heart and secretly buried it in a metal box and did not tell the family. Morris, the fire chief, had also even told this to a local preacher, who then told George. The detectives and George confronted Morris, who admitted it, and they dug up the box. However, when they took the so-called heart to be examined, it ended up being exposed as nothing more than a beef liver. Allegedly, Morris had it placed there in hopes that the Sodders would find it and get some closure. Or at least, that's what the rumors stated. The grieving parents would, for the rest of their lives, do everything they could do to find their children, or to confirm that they had died in the flames. George tried to get the FBI involved, but they only would at the town's request, which was never made. Although, the FBI would later investigate it as interstate kidnapping, but stopped after 2 years when no leads were found. A more thorough search was done, which found a few bones, but these were ruled as being a little too old to be the children. And even weirder, they had not been exposed to flames. These bones were later confirmed to have came from a local cemetery. No explanation was ever given as to why they were even there. The report would also note that it was strange that a fire involving wood that burned so quickly had not left full skeletons behind. The official investigation by authorities stopped in 1950, but the family continued to search, offering reward money as well as putting up a billboard looking for information. Over the next 2 decades, the family would receive several tips and leads, but none of these were really deemed credible, except for the one that came in 1967, when a letter received in the mail postmarked in Central City, Kentucky with no return address was sent to Jenny, who opened it to see a picture of a young man around 30 years old, and on the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ILIL, boys, A90132 or 35, which I could not find what that means." Louis, who was 10 at the time of the fire, would have been about 32 at the time of this letter, so the family hired a new detective to go to Central City to see what they could find. But this detective vanished too, although it's more likely he just took their money and ran. However, the family would continue to try and find information on the man in the photo, even putting it on the billboard. George would pass away in 1969, and Jenny would pass away 20 years after that in 1989, never finding out what truly happened to their children, although the surviving children carried on in their determination to find answers. They believed, as many local residents, that the Sicilian Mafia was trying to extort money from George, and the children were kidnapped before the fire and taken somewhere else, possibly Italy, and it was possible that the children avoided contacting them at the risk of keeping the family from being attacked again. There was also the fact that George was disliked in the community for his outspoken opinions, and many believed the locals in the area intentionally set the fire, and then purposely used the arson investigation to cover everything up. Others believe that the kids encountered someone outside while finishing up their chores and were then kidnapped, while others speculate the Sodders had the children sent away to another family to adopt because the financial strain was too much, although I heavily disagree with this one considering how much time and money they put into finding them. However, the most accepted theory, at least by modern detectives, arson investigators, and armchair sleuths alike, is that they sadly perished in the fire. In fact, one of the key parts of this investigation, which I left out until this point, was that of the police interview of the oldest son, 22-year-old John. He originally told investigators he rushed up to the attic where his siblings were asleep and physically tried to wake them up before leaving. It was only later that he would take back that statement and claim that he never actually even seen his siblings and instead called for them from the bottom of the stairs. Most people now believe that John originally told the truth to investigators and only changed his story to comfort his grieving parents, or possibly out of guilt for not being able to save them. In fact, it's also known now that the firefighters at that time, who were already undermanned, probably just did a cursory search of the home and called it a day. And even if they had did a closer search, they may have not been trained well enough on what to look for. Not to mention, it didn't help that George had contaminated the site by bulldozing it. There's also some rather simple explanations to the other so-called unexplained things that happened surrounding the fire, such as the kids forgetting to turn the lights off and forgetting to shut the curtains, which was deemed suspicious by Jenny. But it's very possible the kids were so excited about Christmas they simply forgot, or it's even possible the youngest children wanted to catch a glimpse of Santa. There's also the part about George talking badly about Mussolini, but Mussolini had already been overthrown by the time this happened, although I guess some Italians still held him in high regard at the time. Then you have the insurance salesman making the veiled threat. That may have been nothing more than trying to convince him to buy insurance. More importantly was the bones not being found, and the fire not being hot enough to disintegrate them. That would typically be the case in a regular fire of a wooden home, but it's just possible that it could have reached the temperature needed if coal and gasoline were in the basement of the house, like was said to be in the Sodders' home. When it comes to music, there may be no other genre that produces more mysteries than rock and roll. And while our next mystery revolves around a blues musician, he has often been described as the first rock star ever. And no, I'm not talking about Elvis. I'm talking about Robert Johnson, the 27-year-old blues player from Mississippi, who made two iconic recordings in 1936 and 1937, which led to him becoming known as the Master of Blues and reaching the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is remarkable considering his recording career lasted all of 7 months. And in that time frame, he became known as one of the most influential musicians ever, being cited by Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, Keith Richards, and Robert Plant as being very influential to their careers, and also leading to many of his songs being covered by numerous other musicians, which is sorta ironic considering he was not that big during his own shortened life, because after his first recording in 1936, Johnson would pass away just 2 years later, and why is sort of another mystery. Just like his early life, no one seemingly knows much about him, and what is known had to be reconstructed over the years by many researchers who have put together a spotty record on his life. In fact, So little was known about Johnson even at the time that months after he died, music producers showed up in Mississippi looking for him to try to book him at a concert at Carnegie Hall, only to find out he had died, which okay, it was the 1930s, and news traveled slow. But even 3 years later, a musicologist went to Mississippi to record Johnson, only to find out that he had died 3 years prior. It wouldn't be until the 60s when his original recordings were located again and released in a collection that he would become the influential musician he was. And by the 1990s, 2 documentaries would be released which followed the research and reconstruction of the life of Robert Johnson. Now, as mysterious as all that was, that's not the main focus here. That, in fact, goes down a much darker road. In doing research to find out more about Johnson's life, they came across a peculiar story, first told to them by fellow blues musician Son House, who claimed upon first meeting Johnson he was a decent harmonica player but a terrible guitarist, which is ironic because Johnson's guitar skills is what he is best known for today. But House continued that Johnson disappeared for a few weeks, and the next time he seen him, Johnson had become a master of the guitar and blues music in general, and this started the legend that Johnson went to the crossroads of Highways 49 and 61 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and sold his soul to the devil, who in turn gifted him with the music skills to become a rock star. But where did House get this story about Johnson? And did he really attempt to sell his soul? It's unsure where House first actually heard the story, as it had been around for a while, but to further elaborate, the legend states Johnson really badly wanted to make it as a musician, and that one night, Johnson was told to take his guitar to a crossroads at midnight. Who told him this is unknown, and which crossroad he went to exactly also varies. But it's here the devil, who according to legend, appeared to Johnson as a large black man, took his guitar and tuned it. Then he began playing a few songs and gave the guitar back to Johnson, thereby gifting him his musical talent over it. There are some variations of this story, as another version cites another blues player, David Honeyboy Edwards, who reportedly seen Johnson leaving his house one night dressed sharply. When asked by Edwards where he was going, Johnson said, to meet the devil. Hours later, Johnson returned with wild eyes and showed Edwards his new guitar skills. This allegedly led to the small, very religious community refusing to talk to Johnson or even speak his name. However, there are a couple of issues with the legend of Johnson and the devil. First of all, the story most likely originates with another blues musician who recorded in the late 1920s, a Tommy Johnson, unrelated to the man in our story, Robert Johnson. This legend was already cultivated around his persona a full decade before Robert Johnson even started his music career, and Tommy Johnson actively encouraged it. Furthermore, the story is basically kind of taken from a much older German legend, that of Faust, based on the very real Johann Georg Faust, a German alchemist, astrologer, and, some say, con man. According to the legend, the very intelligent Faust, who was also very successful, becomes dissatisfied with his life and meets with the devil at a crossroad where he exchanges his soul for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasures, which of course ends very badly for Faust. And that story has been taken time and time again and twisted and retold to modern audiences. Finally, there's a much more plausible explanation as to how Robert Johnson got so much better at guitar in that short few week span that Son House noted. And that is, Son House was just wrong about the timing, or he lied to embellish the story, because according to the records that were later discovered, Son House actually went 2 years between seeing Johnson, where he noted he was an embarrassingly bad guitarist, to seeing him as a master of the guitar. And it's not because he sold his soul to the devil. In fact, Johnson spent this 2 years not only learning and mastering how to play in the style of House himself, but also another blues musician named Isaiah Ike Zimmerman, whom Johnson lived with for one of those 2 years and learned everything he could from him. And to add to this, Zimmerman was well known to practice his guitar in a cemetery at night because it was quiet and no one would disturb him. So Johnson would tag along with him during these night practices in the graveyard and only further spread the story of Johnson selling his soul. Johnson would die at the young age of 27 on August 16, 1938, officially due to unknown causes, which has only made him more mysterious. To this day, though, rumors swirl about what caused the young musician's death. The two most popular theories are syphilis or he was poisoned by a jealous husband. When we talk about ancient structures and ancient mysteries, maybe none stand out more than Stonehenge. Located in Wiltshire, England, the megalithic structure has stood for close to 5,000 years, where according to legend, it was created by Merlin the Wizard of Arthurian legend, who magically transported them from Ireland, where of course they had been put there by giants. Another legend states that the Danes, who invaded England in the late 10th century, put them up. And of course, another legend states that it was actually the remains of a Roman temple. But we also can't leave the paranormal theories out, like it was placed there by aliens to be used as a spacecraft landing area. But of course, all of these are just wrong, because as mentioned, they are way older. Archaeological research on the site goes back to the 17th century itself, where it was studied by a John Aubrey, one of the earliest archaeologists. It's here that he, like so many after him, get it wrong and claim that Stonehenge was built by the Celts, most likely as a religious center used by the Druid priest. But it would be the research over the centuries after this that, with updated technology, a clearer picture would come into focus. Going back to the beginning, in 3100 BC, it started off as just a circular earthen bank and ditch, which they would eventually put these complicated pattern of wooden posts in. By 2600 BC, 80 dolerite blue stones from Wales were brought in to replace these wooden posts, and then rearranged at least 3 times once larger sarsen stones were added. And those stones would be added several hundred years later, making it even stranger. The huge sandstone blocks weighed around 25 tons each and were transported some 19 miles to create a continuous outer circle, and then to create the famous pairs of uprights with the one stone laying across the top. 5 of those were created. The process wrapped up sometime around 1600 BC, meaning this thing was worked on for around 1500 years. And while that sounds very crude and simple, because of the stone's huge sizes, this would have taken around 20 million hours of work to complete, at least according to one estimate. So with all the work, it must have been pretty important, right? But what exactly was it? Although for centuries it has been debated and theorized, like the ones I mentioned earlier, the main 2 theories now come down to a holy site or a scientific observatory, while proponents of both of these theories base their beliefs on the thought that the site was built with the skies in mind, specifically with how it aligns to the sun and moon, suggesting it was used in rituals linked with changing seasons and the solstices. Some even take it a step further and believe that it may have been used with the stars to create a megalithic calendar of sorts, maybe to predict things such as solar eclipses. Likewise, for the proponents of the holy site theory, they suggest that it was most likely built as a center for ancestor worship inside a matching circle, which can be found in the nearby Durrington walls, although this one is made out of wood. However, a new theory has popped up onto the radar in recent years, with some wondering if it may have been built as a place where people came to be healed, which seems to be based on the smaller blue stones, which would have had to be floated and dragged some 145 miles from Wales, which would have taken excruciating physical labor, and suggest that it had to be very important and done for a reason, which was possibly the thought that they could build it and people could bring their loved ones here to get healed. Some more proof of this was found in 2008, when several Bronze Age skeletons were found in the area which showed signs of bone deformities. Even crazier, one skeleton was found of a teenage boy that was from the Mediterranean, suggesting traveling from very far away lands to this perceived place of healing. However, others dispute this, citing that it may have just been a burial ground from the very beginning, as some of the bones that have been found have been dated back to when it was first just a ditch and bank, while other bones have been dated to just around 500 years of that. As far as how they were moved, that's another interesting mystery. Of course, they may have been physically dragged and then floated across waterways, but a new theory is that a type of ball bearings were made using wood or stone and then put into grooves in the stone, which were then pulled by oxen. While another line of thinking is that there's no way these people dragged these huge stones this far. They believe instead that the stones were dumped here by glaciers, and then the people in the local area found them and dragged them a short distance. One of the most enduring and intriguing mysteries from ancient history is the identity of the Sea Peoples. But before delving into who they were, it's important to understand why they are remembered. Infamously, the Sea Peoples were a loose confederation of seafaring raiders and pirates who wreaked havoc in the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age, around the 12th century BC. They are known mostly for their destructive invasions and relentless attacks on the coastal regions of the Levant, Anatolia, and Egypt, which significantly contributed to the widespread collapse of the major civilizations at the time. The first mentions of the Sea Peoples appear in historical records from the 13th century BC. For several centuries, they remained active, with their naval expertise and highly mobile war chariots giving them an advantage in battle. These devastating raids were part of a broader upheaval that ended up causing the collapse of the Bronze Age. They hit some of the most important powers at the time, like the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, which is believed to have been a major factor in their disintegration, and in turn left the eastern Mediterranean in turmoil. But despite all that, the Sea Peoples met their match when they invaded Egypt. During the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, they attempted a full-scale invasion, but they were repelled back in the Battle of the Delta, which ultimately led to the fall of the Sea Peoples. But that leaves us with the mystery. Just who were they? Well, contrary to popular belief, they were not a singular ethnic or cultural group, but a coalition of various seafaring tribes and peoples. This included the Philistines, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Dinyan, the Peliset, and the Wasesh, among others. Each group had its own distinct culture and origin, but they united for a shared purpose of raiding and migrating to this area. As for the origins, theories abound. Some scholars believe they originated from the Aegean, the Balkans, or even as far as the Black Sea. Others propose they were displaced by natural disasters like famine or political turmoil. They may have been part of a larger migration of displaced populations searching for new lands and resources. And since there was a lot of instability at this time in the late Bronze Age, it would make more sense that they weren't a bunch of marauding raiders and were more likely fleeing their own situations. As we mentioned earlier in the video, music, particularly rock music, is home to some of the most dark mysteries, and one of these involves a club you most certainly do not want to be part of. Most of you have already heard about it before, but I'm talking about the 27 Club, which is really just a term for a group of musicians, or, as it has grown, any celebrity that has tragically died at the age of 27 years old. And while it sounds a bit crazy, there's actually a ton of these famous rockers that have died at that age. The phenomenon hit its high point between 1969 and 1971, when some of the most famous ones would succumb to their fates. Brian Jones, a founder of the Rolling Stones, would develop alcohol and drug problems and became increasingly unreliable, which led to him being sacked from the band in June 1969, and a month later, he was found dead in his swimming pool, having drowned. Then, on September 18, 1970, famous guitarist Jimi Hendrix would die from barbiturate-related asphyxia. A little over 2 weeks later, on October 4th, Janis Joplin would die from a heroin overdose, while the following July 3rd, 1971, Doors vocalist Jim Morrison would be found dead in a bathtub, with the official cause as heart failure, although there was no autopsy and the real cause is still unknown, though lots of speculation links to heroin overdose. Now, I can't think of another time in history that this many famous musicians died so close together, and even crazier, at the same age. But I imagine it must have been a sad time for music fans. But even with that, the connection was still not made. It would take 20 more years for that to happen, when on April 5th, 1994, 27-year-old Kurt Cobain would commit suicide. Kurt was a legend from the more modern era, and his death caused a shockwave across music. And it was then that the public, largely thanks to the internet, would become aware of the 27 Club, as many online music journalists would offer up more sensationalist tales about the fated club. But most importantly, Kurt's own mother would tell the AP that, now he's gone and joined that stupid club. I told him not to join that stupid club. Now, what she actually meant is heavily disputed, as author Eric Sagosted, who wrote The 27s, The Greatest Myth of Rock and Roll, would claim that his mother was referring to the fact that two of Kurt's uncles, as well as his great-uncle, all committed suicide. Other journalists tried linking her quote to other Seattle-related musicians who had died from heroin. Regardless of what she did mean, her quote only helped fuel the theory, or should I say, curse of the 27 Club. By the early 2000s, the story faded from the public's consciousness, but it would, in 2011, tragically resurface again when Amy Winehouse would die from alcohol poisoning. She would struggle with substance abuse throughout her life. Strangely, her personal assistant would later tell the press that at 25 years old, she began fearing that she would die at 27, citing she felt she would end up in the club. Now there are many others, too many to go through here, especially once the criteria changed from musician to any celebrity. But I do want to name one more, since we touched on it earlier, that of Robert Johnson, the famous blues musician who is said to be the first rock star that died in the 1930s. But is there anything to this club? Is it really a curse? Or something else? Well, as you may have guessed, it's pretty much an urban myth. In spite of the fact that's often repeated that these celebrities die at a higher percentage than normal at 27, it's simply not true. The data doesn't back it. What the data does show is fame might increase the risk of death among musicians, especially in the young, because it can lead to risky behaviors due to the inexperience with wealth and stardom. But that doesn't mean just 27. Actually, the statistics show that the more famous musicians die at 56, 2.2% versus 1.3% of 27-year-olds. There's also the other outliers like Keith Moon and John Bonham dying at 32 years old, while 75-year-old Ozzy Osbourne, 80-year-old Keith Richards, and 91-year-old Willie Nelson are still alive. Still, there's those that try to link the 27 Club to the supernatural or some kind of conspiracy. And that brings us to the conclusion of the historical mysteries and oddities. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.